Hi, good evening. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Donna Maeda. I'm the Dean of the Kofi Annan Institute for Global Citizenship, and I'm also a faculty member in the American Studies Department at Macalester College. I'll be serving as the moderator for this first event in Untangling Racial Politics and Ontologies, Local and Global Antagonisms and Possibilities. This is a series of discussions organized by the IGC, the Institute for Global Citizenship, the American Studies Department, and the Latin American Studies Program at Macalester. The series has developed from conversations about what's emerging from the coronavirus and protests around police violence. This evening's discussion is the pandemic of anti-Blackness, and you'll be meeting our speakers in just a moment. But first, I have a few announcements and some tips to help you get the most from this virtual event. The event is being recorded for sharing out to people who are unable to join us tonight. A link to the recording will be emailed to all who registered, and closed captioning will be added to the recording. So all attendees' audio will be muted by the meeting host, and we ask that you turn off your video to minimize distractions. If you miss the step, the meeting host will turn off your video for you. And for your own experience, we have a couple of tips. In order to focus on the panelists, we suggest that you click on the speaker view. So if you put your cursor at the top right corner of your screen, you can choose either grid view or speaker view, and we suggest that you choose speaker view. Then in addition, if you hover your cursor over the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little caret right next to the video icon. If you click on the caret and then click on video settings and select hide non-video participants, then the speakers will be highlighted on your screen. And if you didn't catch all of that, the instructions are in the chat, and so you can refer to them there. And if you have any technical questions during the event, please drop a note in the chat to the tech co-host. And again, the chat is at the bottom of the center of your Zoom screen. So for example, if you're viewing by phone and can't locate the settings, the tech co-host can help you out. Later, there will be a Q&A session, and so you can put your questions in the chat and submit your questions directly to the questions co-host when that time comes up. Our intent is to be inclusive and welcoming of all attendees. And we ask that you approach this critical, sometimes uncomfortable conversation with openness and respect to the speakers and for the questions asked by other participants. We do reserve the right to remove participants whose actions are not consistent with Macalester's community standards, which state in part, we do not tolerate anything defamatory or containing personal attacks or any form of harassment. This event will go until 8:30 p.m. Central Time. Approximately 30 minutes at the end will be reserved for the Q&A session. And that's the end of the technical announcements. Although we're zooming in from many places, this event brings together 3 educational institutions, one on Tongva land, one on Ohlone land, and one on the land of the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of the Dakota people. Although our institutions occupy the lands because of forced removals and persistent settler colonialism, these are still Tongva, Ohlone, and Dakota lands. The legal concept of property is built on the violation of Indigenous sovereignty. As we celebrate the removal of statues and the renaming of buildings, we also acknowledge how much of our existence is built on continued violence and erasures of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. As we honor the strength and survival of Tongva, Ohlone, and Dakota ancestors, we're also called to move beyond the symbolic, to center and build with descendants of those whose lands and labor provide foundations for our work and education. We also honor those whose murders by agents of the state inspire the current movement for justice. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Sean Monterosa, Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, and so many others. I invite you to take a moment to breathe and to reflect on these acknowledgements. Thank you. And now we turn to our speakers. I'll be asking each of them to introduce themselves and how they connect with tonight's theme. But to start off, here's who we'll be hearing from. Brian Lozenski is Associate Professor of Urban and Multicultural Education in the Educational Studies Department at Macalester. His work brings together critical participatory action research, Africana studies, and cultural relevance, particularly in the education of youth of African descent. Duchess Harris is Professor of American Studies at Macalester, where she focuses on 20th century African-American political history and civil rights. Bill Hart is the Margaret W. Harmon Professor of Religious Studies at Macalester, where he focuses on religion, ethics, and politics. And Kenjus Watson is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Health Equity Research Laboratory at San Francisco State University. He's also an adjunct faculty member at Occidental College in Los Angeles. His work looks at psychobiosocial effects of racial trauma and apocalyptic education. So, speakers, honored guests for tonight, thanks so much for coming here and being part of the conversation. If you could please introduce yourselves again and talk about how you connect with the theme of the pandemic of anti-Blackness. And just to let the audience know, I've invited the speakers to respond to anything that they hear in the introduction so that they can all move into a conversation. And I'll bring in questions as needed to keep the conversation flowing. But we're really looking at this as an opportunity for the speakers to speak to each other in conversation. So we'll start with Professor Lozenski, and then we'll have Professor Harris, Professor Hart, and Professor Watson. Professor Lozenski, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, everyone. Hoping everyone can hear me okay. Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Maeda, and this exciting series. And I'm glad to be here with my colleagues to be able to kick this off. So again, my name is Brian Lozenski. I use he, him, or they pronouns. And I'm in the Educational Studies Department. And the reason I'm here among this panel is that my work, it sits, I like to say that it sits at the intersection of schooling, education, and critical race theory. And I distinguish schooling from education, drawing from Carter G. Woodson, who many call the grandfather or one of the fathers of the field of Africana studies and Black studies, who suggests that there are two kinds of education. This is drawing directly from his text, The Miseducation of the Negro, that there are two kinds of education, the kind you're given and the kind that you give yourself, and suggesting that the latter is much more important, the kind you give yourself. In this framing, schooling would be the kind of education that you're given. And in my work, I look at schooling as basically a technology of the state for structuring society. And in that regard, you know, it's definitely connected to what Emile Durkheim calls it's a not necessarily a structuring of society, but it's a mirroring of society, so that schools mirror the societies that they're in and do the work of creating the societies that they're in. And so with the complexity of our social worlds, we see that reflected in our school buildings, right? They're not entirely oppressive, and there are cracks for liberatory work to be happening within schools, but largely they do the work of the social structuring that we see and participate in that. Right? They're not operating in silos. And so I juxtapose to that side of my scholarship the side of education, which is more about a liberatory pursuit based in the perpetuation of a cultural context. And so thinking about the myriad ways in which educational pursuits happen outside of school buildings in non-formal and informal spaces, but also the ways in which communities, and particularly communities that have faced some form of marginalization, have used formal schooling as part of that pursuit towards liberatory thinking. And so there's a duality there that exists between school and education, and that's where my work lies. Once we map on this idea of race, and I really like that the series is situating race and looking at race from an ontological perspective, because I think that's the most illustrative perspective of what race actually does in the world. And when we say, we talk about the ontological perspective, we're really asking these questions about the nature of reality and the nature of being, right? And so race is like a perfect place to talk about ontologies, because we know that race is made up. Race is something that was completely invented. It has no basis in biology. It has no basis in any kind of empirical fact. It was made up for the purpose of doing what it does, which is to subjugate. And so thinking about race at the ontological level, it gets at this question of how do you make up something out of thin air and then make it real, right? How do you take this concept from an imagination and then put it into practice? And I think what we'll see across the panel tonight in terms of the ways that each of us think about educational structures, legal structures, religious structures. These are the mechanisms that make race real in the lives of people. And when we start to then talk about this idea of Blackness at an ontological level, Blackness is, and I think it's really important that we make a distinction between thinking about race as an individual identity that each of us is either ascribed to us or that we claim ourselves, and thinking about race as an ontological system. And hopefully we'll get more into this distinction tonight. But one of the things that I try to do in my own work is to look at Blackness and the way in which Blackness has been constructed outside of the bounds of humanity. So we think about the origins of the concept of Blackness and the ways in which in this country in particular, it played out. It was to already support a hierarchy that already existed. And it was to rationalize a hierarchy that already existed. And so to think about a concept that's being constructed outside of the bounds of humanity, where Black folks could not be seen as human, and thus could not be seen as citizens, and thus could not be seen as laborers, and thus could not be seen as, and we can, walk down the line, things start to become clear when we then say, okay, well, why are these racial disparities, right? Why do they exist? Racial disparities exist because race exists, right? And literally there's no other reason to have race. It didn't exist before the disparities. It was meant to support the disparities. And so in my work, what I try to do is to flip the framing and to use Blackness as a way to analyze the human world, right? So it's instead of the human world looking at Blackness outside of its bounds, I use Blackness to examine the human world. And that means I'd go to the perspectives of Black scholars who have been talking about the mechanisms and uses and purposes of education to subjugate and also to liberate. And so my work lies in that balance. I try to have a dual critique, both looking at education as subjugation and balancing that with looking at education as liberation. And so I'll stop there and hand it over to, I believe Duchess.
That was awesome, Brian. Thank you so much. My work overlaps somewhat with Brian's because I'm also interested in educational studies. I have curated 115 books for 4th to 12th graders that focus on race, class, gender, and sexuality issues. And that has been recent work for me. That's what I've been doing for the last 5 years. What I wanted to talk about this evening is what my experience has been on the faculty at Macalester. My academic work focuses on the participation of Black women in politics, and I define politics as both social movements and electoral politics. And I have a few academic books, but the one that kind of is the signature book for my intellectual home would be Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Trump. And in that book, I look at Black women's participation in John F. Kennedy's Presidential Commission for the Status of Women and take that up until the first 2 years of the Trump presidency. But for now, I want to talk about what my experience has been on campus. And I wrote an essay about this, which is entitled Just Black. And so I'll start off by saying that the thing that excited me the most about teaching at a liberal arts college was the prospect of advising Black students. The first Black student I advised was Gretchen Rohr, class of 1998. We love to say that Macalester students are brilliant, but if awards mean anything, Gretchen's talent was recognized when she became a Rhodes Scholar. By most people's standards, she really was brilliant. Gretchen and I hit it off immediately. We had similar intellectual interests, and we shared some hobbies. I started to notice, however, that when I would talk about my family, my stories would end up lost in translation. I knew it couldn't be a generation gap. She was only 7 years younger than I was. After several conversations, I realized that Gretchen was transracially adopted. This made me pause, and I began to see a pattern. Many Black students at Macalester are biracial, queer, first generation, Caribbean, and or African. I am none of the above. I am what a political science professor named Christina Greer, who's on the faculty at Fordham, refers to as JB. That is shorthand for Just Black. What is Just Black? On June 26th, poet Caroline Randall Williams wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. She opens with, "I have rape-colored skin. My light brown Blackness is a living testament to the rules, the practices, the causes of the Old South. If there are those who want to remember the legacy of the Confederacy, if they want monuments, well then my body is a monument. My skin is a monument." I was moved by this passage because my family members are descendants of the US slave trade. I can trace my mother's side all the way back to the 1730s. We are light-skinned because her people came from the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia's plantation. That side of the family entered historically Black colleges in the 1920s. Why do I share this with you? There are virtually no Black students at Macalester with this background. For the most part, Macalester does not attract students who are Black like me. Before I came to Macalester, I considered my Blackness to kind of be like a mainstream everyday Blackness. I'm from the East Coast. Most people I knew were like me. However, when I got to campus, I realized that I needed to broaden my perspective. In the midst of teaching at Macalester, I've learned about queerness, mixed race identity, transracial identity, and the diaspora. I've learned all of this so that students, after they've been to their physics class, their geology class, they can come to my office and together we can find a way to be just Black. Well, the years have passed. It's no longer 1997. And not only am I not their generation, the juniors are younger than my oldest son. So finally, our music is different. Our ideas about politics are different because when I was in college, Reagan was president. Their junior high school president was a biracial African person who identified as Black in a way that they actually understood in a way that I didn't. What does this mean? Black students at Macalester feel simultaneously invisible and hypervisible. This is also different from my experience. My grandparents went to historically Black colleges. They felt welcome and valued. My mother actually grew up on the campus of the Black college where my grandfather taught. I chose a predominantly white institution, but when I was in college, I actually had 14 Black professors. The institution was located in Philadelphia, which is a really Black city. My classmates were mostly American Blacks with parents who'd gone to Black schools. A lot of us were not first generation. Some of my classmates were Caribbean, but the student body at the University of Pennsylvania does not have the African population that Macalester does. Explaining my background to Macalester students has made me more of a real person. It gives them an opportunity to think about global Blackness framed by an American Studies scholar. So we've learned how to come together to embrace our differences. In the space of Grand Avenue, none of us always feels like we belong. The students tell me that they look forward to coming to my office, but what they don't realize is that I look forward to it more than they do because acceptance from them, particularly in this generation, gives me permission to be just Black. So those are my remarks. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Bill Hart. I want to thank Donna and everyone else who put this event together, and I would like to thank everyone who's attending. For the last several years, I've taught and researched the concept of anti-Blackness. I've recently finished a book, which will hopefully be published sometime later this year, titled The Blackness of Black, Key Concepts in Critical Discourse. Essentially, I'm interested in the way in which concepts such as the afterlife of slavery, social death, Afro-pessimism, among others, are circulating in contemporary Black critical discourse, and why it is that these concepts have come to the fore now. So what I want to do actually is just say a little bit about some concepts, say a little bit about an experience that I had at a previous institution, and then maybe end with a little bit of a flourish. So the first thing I guess I would like to say is that part of my interest in anti-Blackness has to do with the inadequacy of the categories of race, gender, and class to get at the depth and the persistence and the specificity of anti-Blackness. And so what I want to do is just say a little bit about some terms. We think about racism. You know, racism is a useful term. It's a term that generalizes. The concept of people of color excludes or violently includes indigenous peoples, and it flattens the difference. This is what's really important. The term people of color flattens the difference between a slave experience and an immigrant experience. This is why it's important to use the concept of anti-Blackness and not merely the concept of racism or white supremacy. It's why the acronym BIPOC, which I actually only came across quite recently, is a thing. For those of you who don't know, it stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. You can see an effort to get at the specificity of the problems that we face in this country with that acronym. At my previous institution, for a short time, I served as the coordinator for diversity initiatives for the College of Arts and Science. I was empowered to shut down a faculty search if I concluded, based upon specific criteria, that the search committee and the department had not done an adequate job in trying to diversify the pool of candidates. My role was not very well received. What was really revealing to me was the reaction of my white liberal and progressive fellow faculty members. They used the concept of diversity to make Blackness disappear. Think about that. They used diversity to make Blackness disappear. And I mean, this is important because what that allowed them to do is not deal with the discomfort that acknowledging and attending to Blackness produced. It allowed them not to think about how difficult it would be and how much work would have to be done in order to address the deep systemic problems that have resulted from the way in which Black people in this country have been treated historically. The current historical reality of anti-Blackness, I'm reading now. The deep structural challenges it posed was perpetually displaced by the citation of other forms of diversity. To put it bluntly, their colorblind and race-neutral accent on diversity was a version of all lives matter, a way of saying that all diverse people look the same to them. That is, a way of avoiding the justice demands peculiar to the distinctive history of Black people in this country. The term anti-Blackness is a quest for specificity in a context where the difference that Blackness makes is often effaced. I like to think about this in terms of the Black quest for social justice that emerged in the 50s, 60s, and into the early 70s. Back when I was younger, there was a lot of talk about racial justice for Black people. That concept got displaced by the language of affirmative action, which got displaced by the language of diversity. In each case, there's a further step away from the specificity of the country's history of injustice against Black people. The desire to avert the gaze, to change the subject, to do anything but grapple with the challenge of Blackness is very strong. That's just what that history I just narrated is about. Facing a history of racial injustice against Black people, which gets watered down and displaced by the language of affirmative action, which then gets further watered down and displaced by the language of diversity. If what matters is diversity, then you can ignore the specificity of anti-Blackness. The murder of George Floyd and others within the context of a global pandemic may provide a small window to make real changes. But the wolf of racial capitalism, of a highly racialized disaster capitalism, stands ready to exploit this moment for the benefit of capital, of racial capitalism, and the perpetuation of anti-Blackness. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you for that, for all those really powerful groundings. Hi, everyone. I'm Kenjus Watson. Thank you, Donna, and really everyone else on the panel, for the organizers, for inviting me into this space from the West. I think that my work really, as we're talking, it really is in conversation with everyone's work on this panel. I look at, or I guess my research focuses on the impact of everyday manifestations or mundane manifestations of anti-Blackness. Folks call it microaggressions or everyday racism, when Chester Pierce, the Black psychiatrist at Harvard, developed the term back in the 60s, he called them offensive mechanisms and went on to say these are really everyday terrors, tortures, and disasters that that regulate, that reinforce and regulate anti-Blackness. And so I think of them in that way, coming from people who've come before me, Daniel Solorzano, amongst others, to look at that. So I trace anti-Blackness, the impact of everyday anti-Blackness, to the cellular level and look at telomeres with the help of the Health Equity Research Lab and folks at SF State. Telomeres are these protective caps at the ends of our chromosomes. They are repetitive versions of DNA that decrease or deteriorate as our cells divide. As sort of analogies to think of the plastic tips at the ends of our shoestrings. You know, when you're a young person, you run around stepping on those plastic tips and they take on damage. Eventually the shoestrings sort of frays. So very similar mechanisms. Telomeres serve a very similar purpose at the cellular level, as do those plastic tips, those aglets on our shoestrings, such that when your cells divide or our cells divide, our telomeres take on damage. They begin to eventually shorten to the point where the cell itself goes into senescence, and we start to experience aging, right? We get gray hair and maybe some cool glasses and mindfulness of our bodies, hopefully some wisdom along with that process. So in looking at telomeres, we know that through the work of folks in public health, that stress can accelerate their deterioration. And in I think the original study that at least really grounded that observation was on mothers whose children were on the autism spectrum. And they compared those mothers' telomeres to a group of mothers whose children were not on the spectrum. And they found within a 1-year time span, the mothers whose children were on the spectrum's telomeres had deteriorated 2 times faster than the moms whose kids were not on the spectrum. The way you can think about it is that they aged in 1 year time, 2 years. I like to think of telomeres also, another analogy is sort of like a car, you know, so when you buy a car, it might be sold in a certain year. I have a car from 2014, but how much mileage is on the car is really the age of the car, not so much when it was created or manufactured. Such is the case with our bodies. You know, we typically mark age with when we're born and how many trips we take around the sun, an annual trip. But telomeres can give us a much more accurate and perceptive look at our age. So I applied that to looking at Black cis men at UCLA who were attending the school. And I wanted to know how our recognition as Black men there, our recognition of our experiences with everyday racism, had any sort of conversation about the rate of our telomere shortening. And what we found is that Black men on that campus who were recognizing much of what you all have shared thus far, that UCLA is endemically grounded and rooted in anti-Blackness, with manifestations that range from interactions with other people on the campus to remnants or structural reminders of the history of anti-Blackness at UCLA. Black Bricklaying Company, for instance, laid every single brick on that campus, to the names of buildings, like the building that I spent most of my time in, Moore Hall, which is named after eugenicists, right? To other kinds of institutional neglect that we've heard from you all in this way, right? The kinds of spaces that are not ever intended and will never be intended for the longevity or the furthering of Black life, but are there at best to either incorporate Black life into a larger strategy or really typically to undermine it. So those of us who recognize that, the students in the study who recognize that and prepared for encounters with this violence every day, tended to have longer telomeres compared to the Black students who had, let's say, to your point, Bill, a more optimistic vantage point or an optimistic framework of the school, of the place. And so to kind of tie it to some things that you were talking about, Ryan, I think it's that alongside some of the work that my colleague Tiffany Marie does, we really look at schooling as an apparatus or a handmaiden, if you will, of the carceral system, of other contemporary technologies, I think you called them, or tools of the state that have always been equipped against the very furthering of Black life. And we conflate oftentimes schooling with education, so I really appreciated the disentangling of that. And we trace that to some epigenetics that we have when we have Black people inside formalized schooling spaces, which another scholar, Damien Sojourner at UCI, calls enclosures. So these sort of enclosures on Black life and the normative practices that we traditionally, I should say conventionally, associate with what we call success or achievement, including compulsory movement through the apparatus, through graduations, up to and into higher education or higher schooling, on through some of what all of us do, right? Which is sit in spaces that were never intended for us and try to make meaning of that sort of place that we're in. That all of those practices, vast and mundane as they may be, really do inhibit the possibility of Black life because they are situated and grounded and actually echo and reinforce the very nature of the project of anti-Blackness, which is, I think I have a student who talks about this, that we are an ontological punchline as Black people, right? The foil of the world, the very counter reference point for what it means to be human, with these schooling spaces being our sort of access point into our hoped incorporation as humans. I like to think that what schooling offers us is that sometimes we get mistaken as human, right? Sometimes through these schooling spaces. And I can show you where I've been branded. It says UCLA, PhD. I can give you all the other contemporary afterlife of those mechanisms in the school. And what I try to do with my colleague is, and her work, and we can talk about it later, but her work is showing us that if slavery has an afterlife, and if we, this is some thinking around like Asa Hillard. So if slavery has an afterlife in the echoing or frame of Saidiya Hartman and others, and if we think of slavery and also flight from slavery as inextricable, those processes are always tied, then that means that there's an afterlife also of maroonage. And I think that what we think of as the work in apocalyptic ed is a way of remembering our always already, to borrow a popular frame, work towards maroonage, towards developing and sustaining life in the otherwise, amidst this ongoing 1400-year terror that we've been under. So that's sort of how I situate some of the work I do, and just really honored to be on this space and learn with and from you all.
So if any of you, I'd like to invite any of you, if you'd like to respond or react to anything that other speakers have said, or I can insert a question, but I'd like to give you the opportunity first to respond to each other.
And I think there are, definite linkages that I'm seeing across what all of us are saying. Kenjus, I find your work, fascinating, and I'd never really come across the concept of telomeres before having an opportunity to talk to you, and it makes me think about, and again, I think all of us were getting at the idea of the mundane. And I think the mundane is the under-theorized space, because what we tend to do is what happened when George Floyd was murdered, is that's the spectacle, right? That's the public lynching. that is the key moment that galvanizes people to make a stand. And certainly we should. But what is much more invisible is the mundane and the everyday. And so, you know, part of what I want to try to do is to help us uncover the mundane so that it becomes that much more visible when we're talking about this concept of anti-Blackness. And so, you know, one of the, like a recent piece that I put out was trying to use a Black intellectual lens or Black radical lens to think about this idea of the COVID pandemic, right? And there's been some great scholarship that's come out recently talking about right, anti-Black racism as its own health pandemic. And I think, as Kenjus was, you know, alluding to, you know, we literally see race as a life-shortening construct, right? And so we can think about the ways that that's played out across communities, the ways that it, you know, we think about mortality rates, we think about lifespans, we can think about, right, all of these different kinds of metrics to measure. But one of the things that I've been thinking about are the questions that are confronting education amidst the pandemic. And so one of the questions has literally been like, what is the risk worth coming to campus, to school? You know, whether we're talking about K-12 or we're talking about higher education, like, what is it worth it, right? I mean, that's literally the question being asked of our community. And part of the idea of the risk, and we take a risk every day, just, you know, getting in your car and driving somewhere is a risk, right? But right now the risk is elevated because of the threat of the virus. And, you know, thinking through the lens of Blackness and thinking about the ways in which Black folks have been positioned with regard to educational projects, the risk of threat and harm and death is a mundane constant, right? And we can trace this back, you know, part of, you know, and I'm thinking about, and I pulled out in the article that I just put out, one of the, I quoted from the Code of Mississippi, Article 3, Section 2 in 1823, and I'll just read it. It says, all meetings or assemblies of slaves or free Negroes or mulattoes mixing and associating with such slaves above the number of 5, notice the social distancing recommendations there, right? So mixing, associating with such slaves above the number of 5 at any place of public resort or any meeting house or houses in the night, or at any school or schools for teaching them reading or writing, under whatsoever pretext shall be deemed and considered unlawful assembly. And a justice of the peace, county, or corporation may issue his warrant to inflict corporal punishment on the offender or offenders, not exceeding 39 lashes. And so, you know, thinking about that policy, right, and thinking about the, you know, the constructs and what we're being told around social distancing, and then in my mind, wondering how my ancestors dealt with that question, right? And so part of uncovering the mundane is to then give us some perspective about that question. What is worth it? What's worth the risk of corporal punishment? What's worth the risk to, you know, to our health to engage in an educational pursuit versus a schooling pursuit? And I think those questions are, I think, part of what undergird this question of anti-Blackness. If we're able to address the kernel of this social system that constructs people who are ascribed Blackness as something less than, right? Something to be thrown away or to be commodified. But yeah, that's one connection that I feel like that I'm making here when hearing others talk.
I want to respond to that, Brian. You know, I hadn't made the connection till right now as you were saying this, and so I'll do my best just to share a quick story and then maybe think about a response. But you know, that risk question is really tied to, I think, how we have all been schooled, and also I want to point out too that schooling or education has been, as you mentioned, a site of maybe a fissure or a sort of crack or a space where we have always done this dance with possibility and death. Under the threat of punishment, under the threat of death, we were attempting to gain tools here after enduring the enslavement of our folks. And so I point that out all the way up to, like, I think around the time I'm born, Reagan and Nixon are understanding the very real threat that mass enrollment, open enrollment in the UC or CSU, Cal State, or UC, University of California system poses when we let any old Black folk get into those spaces. They understood that as a threat. And so there were methods and policies to undermine that and to shift how it happens. But I also think that part of beyond the Black Freedom Project, which is tied to directly trying to maybe exploit these moments of fissure to the end point of Black liberation, there's also this ongoing reality or thought or feeling that schooling can help us, or education can help us gain access to that traditional social contract of social mobility and economic uplift. And I think that is part and parcel, it's happening at the same time. And so I think that my parents are kind of firmly rooted in that idea that doing everything they could just to get some access for myself and my sisters. So they enrolled us in a parochial school in Riverside, California, where I'm from, Moreno Valley. And the school is called Bethel Christian Schools. And my mom and dad joined the church so we could go to this school. My mom drove the bus for the school. She did janitorial work. Also, we could go to this school for $10 a month, right? For 4 of us each, which sometimes is very difficult for us to even make that. But she was the kind of person who would, if the teachers in these regular classrooms had to go to the bathroom, they would call Terry Watson. And so my mom was that person. She'd come and stand in the classroom so these teachers could go use the restroom, and just was like running over anything she could to get us access. But as a kindergartner, just this idea of mundaneness and what the risks are. As a kindergartner in this predominantly white school, I remember walking in and you had these green, red, and yellow tags on the wall. And so those of us who work with schooling spaces know that it's part of a sort of punitive system, a carceral policy, that green meaning you're in the good, yellow, hey, you're getting in trouble, red means you might get kicked out of the classroom. At our school, red meant you get kicked to the principal's office, which is either suspension, or parochial school in the late 80s, early 90s, SWATs, corporal punishment, with a thick wooden paddle. And my parents were not willing to let me be suspended because you miss school time. The whole point is we're paying for you, right? So I remember by October in my kindergarten year, walking into the classroom and seeing Mrs. Friesen, and she said, "Good morning, Kenjus. Good morning, Mrs. Friesen. All right, go ahead." And I'd go up to the board where they have it child size, right? And I changed my green tag to yellow from the start, because for her policy of dealing with me, one of 3 Black children in the class, was to just start them off at yellow as a threat that if you messed up, you were gonna. And so literally, I remember going into the class, my mundane morning as a 5-year-old was I might get swatted with a paddle 3 times by the principal, ironically named Dr. Just, a white man named Dr. Just. So I think about that as a mundane form of violence from schooling. And I would forward that all the way to today and say that in this fight for going around across the country, not just defunding, but abolishing police, not just getting some of these carceral policies out, but undermining the whole process of schooling, I would say that those places still have violence. And I know critical educators who were celebrating at least some of the gains that their students got during this pandemic, which is they weren't exposed in a day-to-day, face-to-face encounter with people who understood themselves as human because they understood these babies as not human, you know? Although online space, there's still policing. I think someone in Michigan got literally incarcerated for not doing her homework online. So I think that they're a young Black girl, 15-year-old. So I think that is a reality we have to sort of respond to. But I would just push that what was already going on in school, the lack of that social mobility contract, we don't see large gains from success in schooling. That's just not true. That we have this kind of, I think, this possibility through organizing to actually use this time to exploit the fissure by taking a little bit more community control of our educational efforts with our kids. That's a tall order, but I do think that it is one way that we can push back mundanely against the everydayness of harm that happens with our young folks. Sorry to take so much space there, y'all. It just inspired my memory of that.
I certainly have a response, but I want to make sure.
Yeah.
That's a rich conversation. I didn't necessarily want to go in a different direction, but you know, I am struck by the talk about COVID-19 and what it's revealed, you know, about inequities in our society and the way in which those inequities manifest in, you know, Black bodies. But I think we think about anti-Blackness long-term and we think about it systematically. I think we can always see the ways in which society as a whole has been affected in deleterious ways by anti-Blackness. I mean, if I were to, you know, if I was to point to one thing that distinguishes the welfare state regime in Western Europe from the United States, I would point to the presence of Black people and a desire to make sure that Black people don't get certain kinds of resources. And the way in which that desire has become, you know, normative. I can remember so well when, you know, Proposition 13 passed in California. I think this was back in '78, predicated upon a desire not to have tax dollars go to undeserving people. And we know who those undeserving people are. And so much of American social policy for decades has been predicated upon this notion of denying resources to people who are deemed as undeserving of those resources. So much of our social policy is shaped by that. That's why our infrastructure is in disrepair. That's why we've hollowed out our educational system, because we don't want resources going to undeserving people. And that undeserving population in the first instance has a Black face.
I mean, your comments, Bill, make me think about your earlier comments about the white liberals and progressives who want diversity but don't know how to examine their own anti-Blackness. And so it makes me think about white residents who are either in Minneapolis or St. Paul and want their kids to go to school with certain kids, but there really isn't the recognition that the children aren't being treated similarly. Because Kenjus's experience when he was 5 is no different than a child who's 5 now. And also it links to what we've been talking about in terms of, you know, not just this corporal punishment of, you know, if there's going to be a paddle or if there's going to be that and what's, you know, red, yellow, or green, but also the actual police in the schools, but only in certain schools, and how even liberal parents might not be concerned about that because they know the police aren't there for their kids. So that's just what comes to my mind hearing all of these comments.
Another thing, and I know Donna, you probably have other questions. But I think one more thing that this brings up though is around this construct of abolition. And so, for instance, both Minneapolis and St. Paul severed their relationships, official contracts with their local police departments. And what they have yet to sever are the reasons why police were deployed on students, right? And so, I mean, first off, we know that police in schools are much more, infinitely more likely to have encounters with students in the building than they are with outsiders trying to intrude on in the building, right? So we can, kind of like stop that argument right away. But the what remains is, why are police being called, right? And so thinking about and this isn't just in schools, right? This is the idea of like why police are being called generally, right? And so we get into these conversations around property, right? Damage to property. Things like in schools, it would be things like insubordination. It would be, and knowing that, again, we can make distinctions between when there's like a fist fight in school, right? But the data show that students are being suspended for verbal altercations much more often than they're being suspended for physical altercations, right? So the verbal altercation, right? I like to call sometimes like George Zimmerman pedagogy, where for a teacher, there's something about a particular student that piques their interest. And then they get into an altercation, a verbal altercation with that student that then results in the student being subject to punishment, right? And it's the same thing that plays out in the relationships where there's something, and that's something I'm trying to get at, right? Obviously is, and we could name it as race, but we could also name it as the performance of race. We could name it as culture that's had race ascribed to it. And so thinking about those, again, the mundane relationships that exist between when you have these, and I'm glad, Kenjus, you brought up Damien Sojourner's work around the enclosures, right? When you have the surveillance, that's a mechanism of enclosure. And so thinking about, instead of us thinking more about the fact that the police exist, thinking about why they're being called is a more generative space to be in, when we can say, okay, let's look at how they're being deployed on communities.
So Brian, could we name it anti-Blackness as opposed to naming it race?
I mean, yes, I think there's an easy move there to like call it anti-Blackness, because, but I think the anti-Blackness, where one of the ways I see it is it comes out in the subjectivity of Black children in school being subject to an environment that is curricularly and culturally disaffirming, right? And so yes, then you have a motivation problem. Yes, you have a problem of, it's a problem of subjectivity. So you're in a building where you do not feel culturally affirmed, you feel psychologically threatened. And any of us who feel psychologically threatened are not, apt to want to be in a particular space. I think any of us can be thinking about ourselves in a meeting, thinking of ourselves in, right, and a place where if our ideas are being attacked, if who we are is fundamentally not being affirmed, and yes, then we will engage in it within a level of antagonism, And so being that, and I think this, we talked about this the other day, Duchess, you know, thinking about your work and your curricular work of developing all of these texts that center narratives of Blackness. And maybe you could talk more about the difficulty you were having of getting these texts in, because, and I, you know, brought up the work of Wayne Allen and Anthony Brown in talking about their macro studies of curriculum, center this notion of curriculum development as a project of Black curricular erasure.
Right.
Right. And so Black centered curriculum has never been, it's always been marginalized. It's always been an add-on, if at best, if not completely erased. And so thinking about this process of curricular development and its relationship to the subjectivities of youth in schools who are deemed Black, that's the mundaneness where the anti-Blackness lies.
I mean, exactly. I mean, briefly, I'll just share that I co-authored a book for 6th to 12th graders about the Black women who worked at the Langley NASA in Hampton, Virginia. And I co-authored a book about Black Lives Matter for 6th to 12th graders. Same co-author, same publisher, and you can guess which book was invited into the curriculum and which book wasn't. And it was all about Black achievement that was permitted by whiteness, which was how they understood the NASA story. That's not how I wrote it, which is different from Black people fighting for their humanity, which was not a narrative that somehow met their standards.
So I think it's time where the questions are starting to come in, but I was wondering, before we move to the questions, you're starting to move to from the sort of understanding of anti-Blackness, and as you're talking, I was thinking about the massiveness and the ways that all social institutions are part of this. So we've been focusing on education, but when Bill was talking about how this works in education, what affirmative action looks like, what diversity does, as opposed to, you know, some sort of tool to undo the harm to African Americans. Part of the reasons we have this way of doing affirmative action is law. Like, there have been lawsuits, and there are only certain ways that you can use affirmative action, and it's gotten watered down. And so the only legally legitimate way is to think about the diversity of voices in higher education, right? And that's a far cry from what it was intended for. And then you're also raising up, you know, racial capitalism, and there's some questions about that. How does that play in? But I also wanted to give you the opportunity to think about what Duchess just turned us to. So law and policing are about regulation. It's about control. That's the function. And at least in education, there's an idea that it should be something else. And the reason that it can be something else for some people is because of scholars like you, right? And so you have people who are working on education rather than schooling. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. So where are possibilities with an understanding of anti-Blackness, where are the possibilities of moving towards something more liberatory? So maybe it could be through Kenjus's idea of, you know, carrying forth the remembrance of Maroons, as well as, you know, regulation and control. But what are some other ways you might think about moving towards a more liberatory frame?
So I can talk a little bit about this. My colleague, we looked, just for folks who raising up the conversation on telomeres. Tiffany Marie up in the Bay did a longitudinal study on youth who had shorter telomeres. Some of the students in my study and her study had telomeres that were shorter than women over the age of 40 who had survived breast cancer. Some of the kids in her study were 14 years old when their telomere lengths were recorded. And in my study, they were 18, 19. So we both had this conundrum of, regardless of how the students may be distinguished by their healthy actions, the prematureness of death for Black people seemed to be coming, or at least tracking onto a cellular level at a young age. And Tiff brilliantly moved towards a longitudinal work. So she started to undermine some of the normative practices of schooling, what we were offered through grading, test prep. I'm thinking college prep beyond the carceral, everyday, mundane violence of interactions with police officers or SROs. The curriculum, as you all are mentioning, those curricular moves that really undermine or strip away Black purpose, sense of self, relational intelligence with others, a sort of groundedness in the earth through what we have, I guess, thinking around it as a different cosmology, one that harkens back to our indigeneity, and that we also get by virtue of ourselves from our ancestors. So she started, and her colleagues implemented that in their work, and found that over a year time, the youth whose telomeres who again were shorter than that comparative sample of breast cancer survivors, had not only stopped shortening, but they had regrown. And they continue to regrow the more that these folks, these educators, undermine schooling. And so it's this general understanding that when we center Black wellness, we will cease doing school. We cannot center Black wellness and do school. Those are antagonistic projects, like anything else that's coming from this anti-Black ontology or ground that we're standing on. And so I think what we're building around are the ways that that harken back to some of Woodson's observations, or those maroon societies, the kind of work that Tubman was doing on those fugitive flights, those kinds of educational moves, the understanding of one's relation to the earth, language reacquisition, or at least affirming Black language, the reliance upon and re-engagement with different cosmological forms of ancestral veneration, and then what just taking off the board the idea that schools lead to social mobility, moving towards ways of allowing us to have more self and communal reliance. So we are aligning ourselves with also the indigenous communities of Turtle Island to think about relationality and to think about what it would mean to build collective communities that are not really reliant on a community within or structured within the nation state. And this is, of course, work that's already been done in many places. And so we're aware of how it's been repressed and undermined and incorporated and just obliterated in times past, and trying to move in a way that's really mindful of all of that. I think of that as these alternatives. And there are other folks who are doing alternative work, like these school abolitionists, the Abolitionist Teaching Network, Education for Liberation, many folks who are doing this. But to lift up an adage that maybe Frank Wilderson offered us, that he wasn't against police violence, he was against the police. I think we'd say we're not against violent schooling practices, we're against schools as they are currently constructed. And so we're thinking alongside and trying to lift up projects that are thinking alongside school abolition, return to education, and rememory, something we get from Toni Morrison and others who invite us to remember a deeper relation to one another.
So if it's all right with you, is it okay if we move to some of the questions from audience? Okay, so I'm going to combine some questions, and some of them are related to what you've just been talking about. So Kenjus, in your last comment, I was thinking about Duchess's opening and talking about how as she was learning about the complications or the intersectionalities of Blackness, she was able to come back to being just Black with people who had different experiences and different, transracial, diasporic, and all of that. Like somehow there was this coming back together to being just Black. And then with your final comment, Kenjus, it seems like as you're talking about relationality, is there a way that in spaces of education where some sort of relationship building or community building can be part of a more liberatory project, and what would that look like? And if so, another question is could it be something in relationship to BIPOC peoples? And understanding undoing anti-Blackness in community and relationship together with other communities. What do you see as possibilities for that, or limitations?
I think that starting with limitations is ontology. So one thing we know if we look at our structural positionality, one thing that makes anti-Blackness, or what kind of elaborates around the social death perspective, is that the violence against us doesn't have contingency. So it's beyond economic exploitation. It's beyond something like what we see with indigenous people of Turtle Island. Not beyond, but different, let's say, different than what we see with indigenous folks to Turtle Island, the genocide and erasure and violence that the folks who have had sacred relation with land here it's contingent, obliterating human reality, but nevertheless contingent upon something that we could look at today and go, the reason why this state is against these sets of peoples and these sets of cosmologies has rational kind of thinking behind it, right? They have something that the state wants, land, relation, etc. And we could write sentences like that. This is again lifting up some of what probably Bill can say better than I around Afro-pessimism thinking. And I think that reality undermines, that ontology of anti-Blackness undermines some of our attempts at coalitional work, right? I have a friend who's part of the Neh Nation and was recently sharing how there's a conversation amongst folks within her tribal community that are coming to terms with the fact that there's an anti-Black word to refer to Black people within the Neh community, within the Dene language for Black Dene people, right? They're being challenged about that. So anti-Blackness is global. Its mechanisms may be different, even its history, but the logics remain embedded and have really served to structure the world. Prior to Enlightenment, prior to Europe is really a Johnny-come-lately to the whole game. If you go back to sort of movements by the Arab slave trade, so I think of it as the oldest operating system that we still have running in its intended form, and so I think that always undermines the possibilities of coalition. What's necessary or possible then would be a reckoning with that ontological reality, and a sort of to go to like what maybe Fanon offered us is like an uprooting of that germ and rot in out here, in here, and out here across all of our different relations. So I'm not saying, I also want to be clear, I'm not saying that there's something we need to give Black people in order to do this work. I think so much of our attempts at educational interventions begin from a deficit. We have to help Black people do X, Y, and Z. I'm saying that we already have everything right within us, and it's an affirming of that. Maybe similar to like how Haiti was like, you know what, we're all gonna be Black. That's what we're gonna do. That's our attempt. National negation of the possibilities of separation through an ontological violence. I think that there's something to that. Of course, Maroon communities themselves were predicated on all kinds of different people, indigenous to Turtle Island, indigenous to other parts of Africa, even some Europeans who were about the process of building new cosmologies and working from there. So I think that it's possible, but difficult.
Bill, I wonder if you have something to add to this too.
Yeah, I don't think I want to go into it too deeply. I suspect that Kenjus and I disagree a little bit on how much we want to take from Wilderson. I'm not sure about this absolute distinction that he draws between anti-Blackness and other forms of subjugation, but it's a provocative thesis, and it gives us much to chew on. I mean, I'm interested in this current moment for a lot of reasons. You know, people, some of the questions are looking for hope, and I get that, but I also want to push back on it a little bit, because that desire to turn quickly to hope and to solution-oriented thinking, to me, is a telltale sign that people are having difficulty tarrying with the difficulty, to staying with the ugliness, to actually knowing what it is. So there's a desire to kind of skate past that as quickly as possible and go to solutions. But when you do that, you never really get a handle on the scope and the depth of the problem that faces us. I think about the way in which major American corporations have reacted to, the George Floyd, other murders. Have those corporations had a change of heart? No, they are simply trying to protect capital. They're trying to find new ways of extracting wealth. That's what it's about.
Right.
To some extent, I think that's the same thing that colleges and universities are doing as well, with all the statements they're coming out with. I hope McAllister is different, but I have to wait and see. So that we can use what sounds like affirmative and liberating language to keep systems in place. That's my fear. Because when I look at American history, every significant movement or step forward by African Americans has been quickly followed by backlash. We shouldn't forget that Trump followed Barack Obama. That's not a coincidence. That's the way American history works. I fear, and it may already be happening, that there will be a backlash to what's happened around the killing of George Floyd and others. I was looking at a Brookings pie chart today, which shows that in these recent protests, 54% of the people on the street have been white, only 21% Black. Nothing like that. We've never seen anything like that. Maybe it's real. Maybe it'll have some staying power. But I suspect that things are going to revert to the norm, and then there's going to be backlash. So I can't help being a little bit pessimistic, because that's what history has taught me to be.
Well, Bill, I know I've mentioned this to everyone on this panel before, but we in the past spoke about Charles Blow's op-ed in the New York Times when he said, are people there because they'd been quarantined and Coachella was canceled? And so the notion of protest as fad is concerning, because we need to ask ourselves, where will we be 6 months from now? And if people aren't still outraged, then we have a problem.
Well, and I think in education or other institutions, there's kind of an outpouring of support right now for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so if we think, as with Bill's point, what are the solutions? Well, here's here's a checklist of things that we can do to increase our diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that becomes the solution rather than getting anywhere near what you're talking about. There are a couple of questions. I'm trying to decide which direction to go here.
Can I add one more?
Sure, yeah.
To the last piece, I was thinking about, again, I like Bill, your point about solutions, and if we think about, if we kind of reject these notions of the solvable, of if we're able to get ourselves away from this Martin Luther King promised land idea, right? That we would be able to, right? Because I think that also ignores human history, where power configurations have always been at play. They always will be at play. I like to think about race and anti-Blackness as a social sciences metaphor to the Anthropocene, right? And this idea that we have these geological markers on the world now that have, shown that like human beings are here, right? And that, those geological markers like plastics in the ocean and technofossils and all those other kind of things that exist in the world are here. And there is no like pre-time. And so I think race operates the same way. I don't think we can go back to a pre-time of race, because it's an idea, right? And it was an idea that was unleashed. And it's been used to organize our social worlds to such an extent that I think it's almost impossible to get out of it, right? I think it's so embedded in the sense that, you know, for instance, even, you know, Black folks, we talk about Black love, Black excellence, Black joy. And I think those are important ideas because they are about a sense of reality that is completely, you know, non-existent in terms of the project of what Black is supposed to be, right? So it is about like a futuristic imagining of something. And yet, you know, I think the idea though of Black and the idea that people who have been, Blackness has been mapped onto them have taken on the identity as central and core is one of those indicators that the idea, the concept is here to stay, let alone what folks who have been constructed and have become white, right, have to say about that, right? And, you know, one of the things that, and I think this is part of where I think when we can think about liberatory projects, part of it is, I think, deep and intensive racial literacy projects, because I think what we do need for people to understand is that if we construct race at the ontological level, that means that people, regardless of how it gets mapped onto their identity, can begin to question that, right? And that's what we see that allows for folks who are different racial identities to participate in anti-Blackness or to participate in trying to appeal to or get proximity to whiteness, right? And we see that in lots of the projects that folks are engaged in. And I think we actually need a multiracial coalition of people to be continuously rejecting the ontology of the ontologies of race. And I think because part of what I think people want, and Indigenous scholar Megan Bang talks about this. She says that what people seem to be arguing for in the social justice movements is a pluralistic, multiracial settler society, right? And pluralism and multiracialism, you know, plural equality and or equality and multiracialism can't go hand in hand because it actually is like defeats the purpose of race and what that's actually about. And so we'll just agree on the settler practice. So, you know, so I don't know if that helps in terms of thinking about liberatory projects. But you know, and so I'll balance that with what I would also describe as counterpublics, and these are spaces where people can go to regroup from the constant pressures and stresses and toxicities placed on them with people who are who they're connected with, and so in my work that looks like a project called the New School for African American Thought, where people gather monthly to engage in discussions and lectures that are about understanding African people of African descent in the U.S. and abroad.
So I think there's time for two more questions. One is more theoretical, and I think in some ways it gets back to what you think this moment is. And then there's another question that's a more grounded one. So maybe we can end with a more grounded one from a parent, actually. So the more theoretical one is, in The Source of Self-Regard, Toni Morrison makes the interesting distinction between crisis and conflict with regard to societal issues in the US, including issues of race. Essentially, she argues forcefully that American society tumbles from crisis to crisis, but the cathartic moment of conflict, which is akin to Habermas's notion of communicative ethics, but that moment of conflict is always forestalled, especially when Blackness comes into the discussion. Could you address some of the elements in that distinction that may be or may not be relative to the current protests in the way of the assassination/lynching of Mr. George Floyd? Do you think it signals a moment of crisis, another one, or is it the tipping point towards conflict and candid discussion for the sake of mutual healing and across the board disalienation, to use a Fanonian term? And then there's apologies for the longish query. But I think that that's interesting, you know, is this a moment of crisis that is just a crisis that will be handled? Or is it a moment of conflict that actually signals that something else is happening, or something else might be possible, or something else might come out of it?
I think that's what we all want to know. And I think it's too soon to tell. And I mean, I've already sort of stated my fears that, capital is very nimble. We can already see corporations very quickly trying to exploit the situation so that they can make more money. And a lot of people will be seduced. A lot of people will be fooled by that. A lot of people will be bought off by that. So it might simply be capital and other powers that be managing the crisis, rather than actually a moment where the conflict actually breaks out into the open and something new, qualitative advance over the way things have been can be made. That's what we hope will come out of this.
Okay, so then there's a number of more grounded questions that really start to get more at the question of the possibilities for authentic changes, especially in institutions, and especially in institutions that we work in. And so maybe that's a general question. Like, do you see any possibilities at all? And what might that look like if it's not sort of avoiding the problems that Bill outlined, especially like the diversion from what actually needs to be attended to in institutions? That's a broader question. A more specific one, though, is, and so if you could choose which one you'd like to answer, is from a parent. And this parent wants to know, this notion of uncentering schools seems to be appropriate at this very point during COVID as a point of consciousness and empowerment of Black parents to take this time as an opportunity to control their children's education and to infuse them with a different Black-centered curriculum. So it's directed at Kenjus, but I think for the rest of you as well, what can you offer parents at this time in thinking about this? So the specific question about educating children in this moment, and the broader one is, what are possibilities for more institution level changes?
I mean, it seems to me educating Black children during COVID, you need to have a lot of socioeconomic privilege, and you need to have someone who has some time. And so in affluent neighborhoods, streets are setting up pods to educate their children. But my question is, how many Black Americans live in physical spaces that are large enough to provide this opportunity? And then they have access to the educational materials, and then they have someone who can convey it. That's a lot of moving parts that most Black people, I would contend, even some of us who are on this Zoom call right now, would struggle pulling that off. And so that right there says so much about the structure of it.
I think this is, with the work that I do, people often ask like why I teach at an institution, right? Why do I teach at an institution of higher education? And part of that, I think, is looking to the tradition of the liberal arts. If we actually look at what the liberal arts is intended to do, stripped of the elitism that's been put there, but part of it is the ability to ask literally questions about our social worlds, right? And our natural worlds, right? And, you know, I think about, and Bill, you probably know this, but, you know, Cornel West talks about the liberal arts as literally preparing people to understand how to die. And that sounds very morbid, right? But you know, Donna and Bill and I had the opportunity last year to be in South Africa, and we were on Robben Island where you know, Mandela spent 27 years. And it turned out that the only prisoner to ever have been put in an isolation on Robben Island was not Mandela, it was Robert Sobukwe, who was a leader of the Pan-Africanist movement in South Africa. And one of the questions he was asking is, how can man die better? And I didn't necessarily understand the question, right? But I think today I understand it, right? It's, the question is, how do we create a world where people die better? And that means understanding what leads to premature, unnatural, right, unsettling types of death. And if that's not a liberal arts question, I don't know what is. And so that's, in my mind, what I could offer parents, students, people who would come to a place that aspires to live in the liberal arts tradition. And I would also suggest that when we talk about Black education, that those questions are fundamental to folks constructed as Black as well. Probably more so.
Wow, that's quite a note. I think we need to end it there. Wow, thank you so much. I really hate to end this conversation. And I think this could go on for a very long time. So I hope that there continue to be ways to engage with you. So I really appreciate all that you brought forward for us to think about. And I know that everyone's going to be thinking about this for a long time. So to audience members, I do want to let you know that this is a series. So please watch for announcements for the next event. And it will be entitled Anti-Indigeneity and Anti-Blackness, Pandemics of Imperialism. And this panel will be 2 weeks from tonight on Monday, August 10th at the same time, 7 to 8:30 Central Standard Times. And the speakers for that event will be Professor Olga Gonzalez from the Department of Anthropology and Associate Dean of the IGC, Professor Karin Aguilar San Juan, Chair of American Studies and Associate Director of the Series Center for Scholarship and Teaching, Professor Katie Phillips from the History Department, and Professor Kiri Saliata from American Studies. So watch for announcements about that. And I also want to say as we end, thank you to everyone who made this event possible, especially the Department of American Studies and the Latin American Studies program. Ted Wilder in ITS, we couldn't have done with all of your advice and knowledge. And especially also the team in the IGC, Ruth Yanish, Meg Thorson, Matt Katsaris, and Zinnia Schwartz, who have kept everything running smoothly, kind of in the background of everything that we're doing. So a final thank you to tonight's speakers. Thank you, Kenjus, Duchess, Bill, and Brian. You're shaking our groundings and you're pushing us to think in new directions about the worlds we live in, and what a more libertarian future might look like. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evenings. Thank you.